All right, so we're in Digestive System I. So we're going to talk about functions of the digestive system overall and differentiate between organs of the alimentary canal, which is the GI tract, and our accessory organs. We'll talk about the processes that happen during digestion. We'll talk about the peritoneum, what retroperitoneal means. We'll talk about what's called Splachnick circulation and review the hepatic portal system. We'll talk about the GI wall, the GI tract wall and the 4 layers that make it up. We'll talk about the mouth and associated organs as far as their anatomy and functions go. We'll talk about saliva. We'll talk about dental caries, which are cavities, and periodontal disease. We'll talk about the pharynx and esophagus, swallowing, and beginning structures of the stomach. So digestive system is broken up into 3 different lectures. So this lecture we go over an overview of digestion, and then we go from the mouth to the stomach. The next class will go from like stomach to, I think, like small intestine maybe, and then the next one will go large intestine to rectum, something like that. I can't remember where the second cutoff is, but we go kind of in order through the different stages of the GI tract. So your digestive system is the alimentary canal, which you can also call the gastrointestinal tract, which you may see in this lecture also referred to as the GI tract. So it's the GI tract plus any accessory organs. And so your GI tract is going to be from mouth to anus, the tract that goes all the way down. So mouth to the pharynx, to the esophagus, down to the stomach, down to the duodenum, which is this first part of the small intestine, jejunum, ileum, which are the other parts of the small intestine, all the different parts of the large intestine, including the colon and the rectum and the anus. That's the GI tract. But then we have some accessory organs that are not part of that tract, but that contribute to digestion. They mostly contribute chemicals to digestion. So that's going to be things like the liver and the gallbladder and the pancreas. Those are all considered, and your salivary glands are all considered accessory organs. The function of the digestive system is to process food, to bring it in, break it down, absorb the nutrients, and get rid of the waste. And so we do that by breaking down our complex food molecules into simple molecules that can be absorbed by our intestines. And then, like I said, the accessory organs assist in that food processing by either mechanically breaking things down or secreting chemicals that help break that food down.
Professor, what were those organs again? I'm sorry.
The ones that are accessory are your salivary glands, your pancreas, your liver, your gallbladder, and technically your teeth. But yes, well, yeah. So what major processes occur during digestive system activity? So the first step of the digestive system processes is ingestion. And ingestion is simply putting food into your mouth. That's all it is. No chewing, no moving around, nothing. It's just the act of putting food into your mouth. That is ingestion. And then we have propulsion. This is the moving forward of food. We move the food forward through the GI tract. And this is through swallowing and through a process that we'll talk about called peristalsis. And that's how we move food forward through the GI tract. There is mechanical breakdown. And with mechanical breakdown, we're not making anything simpler. All we're doing is taking big chunks of food and making them into smaller chunks of food that are the same chemical makeup. Okay? We don't change the chemical makeup. With mechanical breakdown, we're just breaking it into smaller pieces so they have more surface area so that we can break it down with chemicals faster. So that includes chewing, churning, which happens in your stomach, and then segmentation, which we'll talk about later, that happens in your intestines. And then we have chemical breakdown or digestion. So digestion or chemical breakdown is where we make things simpler. We take a polymer and we break it down into simpler and simpler complexes until we get to the monomer. What is a monomer for a protein? Amino acid. What is the polymer for a nucleic acid? Nucleotide. What is the monomer for a carbohydrate? Monosaccharide. And then what do fats break down into? Glycerol and fatty acids. Yeah. Oh, that's Professor Green. What did she say? It's not going to show me. Yes, I am. It's a recording.
I'm just making sure. I'm not trying to.
No, you're fine. No, you're fine. No, I did record it. Thank you for checking. Sometimes I forget. Okay. No, you're fine. And Professor Green says she will make it, so the first lab will have Professor Green, but we're going to talk about mostly what you're going to be looking at in lab today anyway. Okay, so after chemically breaking things down into their monomers, then we can absorb those monomers. We cannot absorb complex structures into our blood. They have to be monomers in order to fit through the capillaries of our GI tract, either the actual cardiovascular capillaries or the lymphatic capillaries that we talked about, specifically those lacteals, which are a specialized lymphatic capillary that pick up fats. So absorption is where ions and molecules move into the blood and lymph. And then the last step is defecation, which is the elimination of everything that we could not use. So this kind of just shows that whole pathway. So again, ingestion is just placing food into your mouth. Then we have our pharynx, which is our throat, esophagus, which is this long muscular tube. In the mouth and in the stomach, you're going to have mechanical breakdown happening. So chewing happens at the mouth, churning happens at the stomach, and then segmentation happens at the small intestine. And then propulsion is just moving food forward down the GI tract by either swallowing initially or peristalsis. And peristalsis happens the entire way from the esophagus all the way down to the anus. Then we have digestion, which is using chemicals to break things down to simpler parts. Absorption happens at the blood vessels and our lymph vessels, specifically the lacteals. And then defecation is getting rid of unusable material in the form of feces. So our GI tract has 4 layers and is usually surrounded by peritoneum. Peritoneum is what we call the serous membrane in the abdominal cavity. And so the abdominal pelvic cavity is lined with moist serous membrane, which is the layer that lines the inside surface of the body wall. Talking about your serous membrane. Which one lines the body wall or the cavity that the organs sit in? Parietal. And so what is the layer that actually touches the surface of the organs? Visceral. And the way that the organs of the digestive system work in the abdominal cavity is there are a bunch of different organs that are all suspended in different places. You have the liver at the top, the stomach somewhere in the middle, and then your intestines are either here for the small intestines or on the outside for the large intestine. They're kind of just all scattered throughout the abdominal cavity, all suspended by what are called mesenteries. And so mesenteries are where the serous membrane, so usually if we have an organ, so don't make fun of my heart. I'm not going to draw an anatomically correct heart right now because that'll take me forever. But usually our organs in a serous membrane, they're kind of just encased by those 2 membranes with a sac in between, just like that. But because the peritoneum is such a larger membrane, and again, it suspends all these organs in different places, sometimes, especially because we have tubing that occurs, sometimes that visceral and parietal layer fuse together on the back end and create a mesentery. Okay, and that's how they suspend to either the dorsal wall on the back or the ventral wall on the front. So they make these mesenteries. And these mesenteries are just 2 layers of that serous membrane fused back to back, and they act as a passageway for vessels and nerves, both blood vessels and lymphatic vessels and nerves, to make their way to those organs in the different places that they're situated inside the abdominal cavity. So sometimes we'll have a dorsal mesentery, like this one I just highlighted. So this is a dorsal mesentery that holds the organs to the back wall. And then sometimes we have a ventral mesentery that holds it to the front wall. It all just depends on its position in the peritoneal cavity. So this mesentery is a double layer of peritoneum. The layers are fused back to back. It extends from the body wall to the digestive organs, provides routes for blood vessels, lymphatics, and nerves. It holds organs in place, and a lot of them is where we actually store fat. And I'll talk to you about the main place that we store fat in a little bit. So any questions about mesentery or the serous membrane for the digestive system? Yeah?
Is it similar to like this scenario where you showed the balloon being punched in? It's like,
Yes, but this is just because of the way that they're not just kind of encased in a single, it is a single cavity, but it's a much larger cavity with different placements. The way that they're held is, again, sometimes those layers just come together on the backside to attach it to the back wall.
I'm confused by what you said when you say backside.
So you have this whole, abdominal cavity. You have a ventral side where your tummy is, and you have a dorsal side where your spine is. And so you have this whole cavity on the inside. And because, let's say your transverse colon is towards the front a little bit more and kind of goes around and down, there is a mesentery that holds it to the back wall, that anchors it to the back wall. Because if they didn't have these mesenteries that were anchoring it to either the back wall, the dorsal wall, or they would just free floating and they'd be bumping into each other. And so this keeps them anchored in place so that they kind of stay away from each other and they're not just falling all over each other all day long. Yeah. So when they're held completely surrounded by this peritoneum, like this tube of the alimentary canal, which could be an intestine, could be the esophagus, but when they're fully encased by that peritoneum, they're called an intraperitoneal organ. Within the peritoneum, they're fully surrounded by membrane. But then there are some organs that actually are not inside that membrane, like most of them are, because sometime during embryonic development, they just fell outside of that double layered membrane. And so sometimes they just kind of sit on the back wall and are only covered by that serous membrane on their front and sides. And there's nothing on the back. There's no double layered membrane on the back. Okay? And when they're like that, behind the peritoneum, behind the sac, we call them retroperitoneal organs. So this includes things like your kidneys that sit all the way in the back, so they're only covered by membrane in the front. Your pancreas is also like this, and different parts of your intestines as well. So again, if it's fully encased by membrane, we call it an intraperitoneal organ. But if it sits on the back with only membrane covering the front and its sides, it's called a retroperitoneal organ. And one thing I do want to mention, if we go back, the mesentery, because it's made up of different tissue types and holds nerves and vessels, the mesentery is considered an organ itself. It's not just a structure, it's an organ. It's made up of multiple tissues.
A good way to remember retro is retro back.
Yeah, like in the past. Yeah. So this is kind of a sagittal view of these mesenteries. Some of them I had hidden, and if you're looking at the slides that I have in the lecture notes, but then I just decided to bring them back because you do cover them in your lab. So if you're following along in the slides themselves, you can write these in. But these are all the different mesenteries. And so you can see here are here's the small intestine, all these blue here. These are all small intestine tubes. And you can see they're suspended to the back wall by this green double layered structure here. So that would be a mesentery anchoring those intestines to the back wall. And it'd be considered a dorsal mesentery because it's attaching to the back wall. And then you can see here's part of the pancreas right here. And so you can see the membrane is only covering the top or the anterior surface and the sides. It's all the way to the back. So it doesn't have that serous membrane on its backside. So that's why we call it retroperitoneal. Also, the duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine, also retroperitoneal, is all the way to the back, so its backside is not covered by that membrane, only in the front. So any questions about that?
What's the, I think you had it covered, maybe, do we have to know the one that's like in between the liver and the stomach?
This one right here?
Yeah.
No, that's called the lesser omentum. You don't have to know that. You only have to know the greater omentum, which is you guys remember when you guys open up the torso model and in front of the intestines, there's like this little flappy sheet that is called the greater omentum. So that is considered a mesentery. It keeps all of those organs, kind of all the intestines in place. And also it's a place to store fat as well. So mostly, I think maybe we mentioned this before, maybe not. But for females, we hold most of our fat in our breasts and our butt and our hips. Men hold their fat mostly in their abdomen. And it's actually in that little flappy sheet that we have in that torso model. So that actually gets filled up with fat, and it's called visceral fat. And so men hold theirs in their stomach. Yay. Hey, but good thing about women is that eventually you're going to go through menopause, and then you're going to stop producing estrogen in the same way that you do. And it's estrogen that directs our fat to our butt and our hips and our breasts. And so when we get older and our estrogen levels drop, more of that fat goes to our tummy. So something to look forward to. So a couple other ones that you're going to have to look at today in lab is this mesocolon. Now it's called the transverse mesocolon more specifically, and it holds the transverse colon, which is the one that goes across to the back wall. That's going to be on your learn list today to look for the transverse mesocolon. When we dissect the pigs next week on Monday, so excited. There is these mesenteries called mesentery proper that hold all the intestines together but also apart from each other. If we didn't have these mesenteries, there would be this really long tube that could get twisted and wound up on each other. But we have these mesenteries, which are a sheet that keeps them kind of separated but also together in the same spot. So what you can do when you get to the pig dissection and you grab the intestines, you can kind of stretch them and you can see this sheet that's connecting them all together, which is kind of cool. Okay, and so that serous membrane or the peritoneum can experience something called peritonitis, which is inflammation of that double layered membrane. Causes of that inflammation include a burst appendix, which this is not good because the appendix is the end of your colon, and if it bursts, it has feces in there, also bacteria in there. And so if it bursts, you are now spreading feces and bacteria all throughout your abdominal cavity and all throughout the peritoneum. So this spreads feces and bacteria, causing inflammation, irritation, and an infection. You've now spread that bacteria all throughout your peritoneum, and if you don't get that treated very quickly, it can lead to sepsis and could eventually lead to death. Also, a piercing wound of the abdomen. So if you were to be stabbed or something were to get lodged or perforate your abdomen, can also cause inflammation of that peritoneum because too, that wound, now you can introduce bacteria that's in your environment or on your skin into your peritoneal cavity. Also a perforating ulcer. So we're going to talk about ulcers on Monday. And you can have a gastric ulcer or you can have a duodenal ulcer. Gastric ulcers are more common. And with a gastric ulcer, what happens is there is a certain bacteria that we all carry that can create ulcers where it eats away at the mucus lining of your stomach. And if it makes its way to the stomach wall, it can actually eat through the stomach wall and create a hole. That's a perforating ulcer. And then when that happens, it leaks gastric juice, which we'll later learn is called chyme, into your abdominal cavity. And gastric juice is extremely acidic. And so now you have this acidic fluid all in your abdominal cavity, burning through and damaging that serous membrane, causing inflammation. And then the last thing that can cause peritonitis that we'll talk about is poor sterile technique during surgery, which hopefully nobody experiences that, but it can happen. And if bacteria spreads, leading to sepsis, this can be lethal. So questions about peritonitis? You know, with my shirt today?
Yeah. I'm gonna get one that's upside down for test day, so I can just.
Okay.
Professor?
Yes, ma'am.
So when they say that when you stress a lot or you get mad at that, is that really true about?
Ulcers?
Yeah.
No. Like 90% of ulcer cases are caused by that bacterium that I mentioned, called Helicobacter pylori, which I'll tell you about it later, and you'll have to learn it later. But most cases are caused by bacteria. Now, or too many Takis, too many hot Cheetos, too many of those spicy foods, those can really cause ulcers and damage your stomach. I have a niece who experienced ulcers due to too many hot Cheetos and Takis, so she can't eat those. She can't have soda either, because soda is also acidic. So she just has a really sensitive stomach now, and so she's very sad about it. I know she does it anyways, but she's going to be hurting later.
Like,
Yes.
are your fingers red?
You said the bacteria thing was what?
Oh, Helicobacter pylori, but it's in your notes. It's later. We'll talk.
The same thing as H. pylori?
H. pylori, yeah. Helicobacter is just the full name for it, because it's a genus and then a species. When you name bacteria, you'll learn about that later in microbiology. But that's just its genus name, and pylori is its species name. So the GI wall is composed of 4 tunics, from deep to superficial. So from the innermost part to the outermost part. We have our mucosa. And our mucosa has different layers. The mucosa has an inner epithelium. What do you remember as the main tissue type that runs through your GI tract, your intestines? Simple columnar. Okay. And what are the unicellular exocrine glands that produce the protein to make mucus? Goblet cells. What is the name of that protein that makes mucus? Mucin. Mucin plus water makes mucus. Then we have an underlying areolar connective tissue called the lamina propria. This is going to have capillaries. And this is also where we're going to see our malt as well. The malt is actually going to extend between the mucosa and the next layer, which is called the submucosa. But you'll see it in both layers. And then we have the muscularis mucosae. Now, this is not the main muscle that's going to be moving our food forward. This is a very thin layer of smooth muscle that does small movements in order to enhance absorption of nutrients and secretion of chemicals. So this is not going to move food forward. It's just very small movements to help us absorb things and secrete things. So the next layer is the submucosa. Then we have what's called the muscularis externa, and that's going to be our main smooth muscle that's going to be moving or propelling food forward. And then depending on where we are in the GI tract, that last outer layer is either called adventitia or serosa. And I'll just tell you now, it's only adventitia at the esophagus. Everywhere else it's called serosa. So a slightly different structure, so we give it a different name. But in the esophagus, it's called adventitia. So questions about those layers? Yes?
Which one was the main one? They said blue.
The muscularis externa. That's going to be our main smooth muscle. That's going to propel food forward. This smaller layer called the muscularis mucosae, that's just a thin layer in the mucus layer that just helps with absorption and secretion. Any other questions? Okay. So these are different layers. We'll go through them all. We have a model that shows the 4 layers that we'll talk about. Yeah.
Sorry, Professor, so the deepest is mucosa?
Yes. That's going to be the innermost one that's going to be in contact with the lumen or the opening of the GI tract. So the first one is the mucosa. This is the deepest layer. It is where the lumen is, or the inside, the empty space inside the GI tract when there's not food moving through it. Its functions are to secrete. It's going to secrete mucus, okay, or mucin that makes the mucus, enzymes, and then also hormones. And we'll get into hormones with digestive too. So there are going to be some new hormone pathways that you have to learn, only 3 more. So we'll talk about those later. It's going to be for absorption of nutrients, specifically at the small intestines, although there is very limited absorption that happens at your mouth, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then protection, because there is some molt there, we have some protection against pathogens there as well. The next one is our dense or submucosa, which is dense connective tissues with blood and lymph vessels, lymph nodules, and nerve fibers. So we do have some protection there too. And remember, I said that your mold actually extends across both the mucosa and the submucosa. And these nerve fibers within the submucosa help with communication. Between the different sections of the GI tract. So it allows the mouth to communicate with the esophagus, to communicate with the stomach, and so on and so forth. The next layer is the muscularis externa. It's responsible for segmentation and peristalsis, which I'll talk to you about in the next slide. And it has 2 sublayers. So there is a circular layer that goes all the way around the tube that makes up the GI tract, and then a longitudinal layer that goes down the length of the GI tract. Okay. So you have 2 layers of muscle. So one that makes kind of a ring, and then one that goes longitudinally. And so those 2 muscular layers are going to help us with these 2 different processes, one being peristalsis, the other being segmentation. So peristalsis is only for propulsion, so only for moving food forward. And so what happens is that it contracts. So your muscular layers, that muscularis externa, is going to contract behind the food and then relax, which is going to push the food a little bit forward. And it's going to contract again and relax, and contract and relax, and contract and relax, and move that food forward. Okay, that's peristalsis. Segmentation, which is going to happen at the intestines, and mostly at the small intestine, is it's actually going to contract in front and behind the food. So it's contracting in front and behind the food, which is going to make the food hit against the walls of that contracted GI tract. And as it's hitting against those walls and going back and forth, it's actually being mechanically broken down too. It's being broken down into smaller pieces through segmentation. So this is mostly for mechanical breakdown. It will move food forward just a little bit, okay? But what we rely on for moving food forward is that peristalsis. Segmentation is more for mechanical breakdown. So you'll see in the description, it says, primarily mixes food and breaks it down mechanically, but some propulsion may occur, but we don't rely on this for propulsion. We rely on peristalsis for propulsion. So questions about those two processes, peristalsis versus segmentation. It's pretty easy. Segmentation, you're segmenting it or making it into smaller pieces. Peristalsis, you're moving it forward. Is today Wednesday?
Yeah.
It's my sister's birthday, so I have to remember to call her. Okay. Or else I'll be the worst sister ever. Okay, so we do have a GI tract model that you're going to look at today in lab. This top layer here, that is the mucosa. Oh, sorry, that's too much. No, it's not. I'm lying. This is mucosa. This right here is the submucosa. This here is the muscularis externa. And this top layer would be the circular layer. This is going to be the longitudinal. And then this, the serosa is at the bottom. And it is serosa and not adventitia because these villi here tell you that you're looking at the small intestine specifically. And then, like I mentioned before, you can see here's that. What is the malt called in the intestines? Peyer's patch. So you can see this Peyer's patch does extend over 2 layers. It's in the mucosa and it's in the submucosa. Okay, questions about the GI tract wall? One special thing about this muscular layer that we're talking about, so most of the GI tract will have a circular and longitudinal layer. Your stomach has one extra layer. So your stomach also has what's called the oblique layer, which runs at an angle. Okay. Why it has an extra layer of muscle is because your stomach is going to do a lot of churning, which means it's going to do a lot of contracting in order to help break down food. And so it needs that extra layer for more contractions and more breaking down.
You said it runs at an angle, Professor?
Yeah. Oblique, yes. So you'll only have this third layer or oblique layer at the stomach only. And that muscularis externa at different parts of the GI tract, and we'll talk about them in order as we go through the different organs, they will have thickened portions that are more circular that create a sphincter. And so sphincters are pretty much like gates at different parts of our GI tract, okay? So that the fluid in our stomach doesn't move to the small intestine until we're ready for it to move into the small intestine, okay? We don't want everything just kind of falling down, all come out at the same time. That wouldn't be fun. It all has to be timed perfectly. And so you have these different gates at the top and bottom of each organ in order to keep it moving in a timely fashion. Don't imagine it. It's not fun to imagine. And so the last layer, the superficial layer, is really just the visceral peritoneum. Okay? Just like with the epicardium being the visceral pericardium. We give 2 different names for things, whether we're talking about the serous membrane specifically or the wall that it's part of. And so the serosa, which is the outside layer of the GI tract wall, it is essentially just the visceral peritoneum. But in the esophagus, we don't call it serosa, we call it adventitia instead, but only in the esophagus. And then not part of the GI tract wall at all, but it's there, you can see it on the very outside, are those mesenteries, which are going to have nerves, arteries, veins, and lymphatic vessels that are going to serve those organs of the GI tract. But it's not part of the GI wall. It's outside of it. Splanchnic circulation. So splanchnic circulation is just a circulation, or the part of our cardiovascular system that provides oxygen and nutrients to our digestive organs specifically. So these are all arteries feeding the digestive organs and the return of blood through that hepatic portal system. Because remember, anything that we're absorbing through our GI tract, we want to make sure that that blood gets filtered through our liver first before we hand it off to the heart, to make sure there are no pathogens there, no toxins, no things that don't belong. Our liver can process it first, and then we give it to the inferior vena cava and the heart. So at rest, our GI tract receives 25% of cardiac output. Once you eat a meal, that 25% is going to increase. Epinephrine and norepinephrine, when it's released and it attaches at the GI tract, and it's going to attach at alpha-1 receptors, it's going to decrease blood flow. So which part of our nervous system, our autonomic nervous system, releases epinephrine and norepinephrine?
Sure.
Sympathetic. This is during our fight or flight. So during our fight or flight, we are going to constrict blood flow to these areas because we don't need to digest during our fight or flight. We're not worrying about digesting food or going to the restroom and having a bowel movement during our fight or flight response. Our brain is not there. It's getting out of that situation that we're currently in, whether we're embarrassed or scared or whatever it is. When our sympathetic is turned on, blood flow is rerouted to your brain, your heart, your lungs, your skeletal muscle, not your GI tract. Okay. So on the opposite end, what is during our rest and digest, which is our parasympathetic, what neurotransmitter is being released to increase blood flow? What is it? Acetylcholine, yeah. So acetylcholine will increase blood flow to our digestive organs. So questions about splanchnic circulation? Okay. So our GI tract has its own nervous system called the enteric nervous system. And so what the enteric nervous system is, and this is just an image showing you all the nerve fibers that are running through the GI tract that are highlighted in yellow. It links one section of the GI tract to another. We call it the gut brain. And what makes the gut brain or the enteric nervous system so impressive is that it has more neurons than even our spinal cord. So lots of communication that's going on within our GI tract and also between the GI tract and the brain as well. Questions about that? Okay. So part of this enteric nervous system, we have intrinsic regulation that happens just within the GI tract with no outside influence. How we talked about before about intrinsic regulation of the heart as well. When we fill it up more, it contracts harder. That's a way that it controls its or regulates its own flow. Our enteric nervous system also has intrinsic regulation, where all the communication happens just within the GI tract with no involvement from the brain. And so what happens is the GI tract experiences a change or a stimulus, and you have chemoreceptors for chemical changes, osmoreceptors for water balance changes, and mechanoreceptors for stretching that occurs within the GI tract. And all of those changes are going to send messages along our intrinsic pathway through that gut brain, and then tell our effectors, which are smooth muscles or glands, to either increase or decrease their contractility, if we're talking about smooth muscle, or increase or decrease their secretions, if we're talking about glands. So all that happens within the GI tract itself. So an example is when your stomach gets stretched because food is moving down to your stomach, signals are sent to the small intestine to get preparations ready to release enzymes into the small intestine for when that food makes its way into the small intestine. So it's kind of like, oh, food's coming. Make sure you get ready. Make sure you're producing these secretions so that when it goes to the next step, you're ready to release those chemicals. So they communicate with each other as things are going down the GI tract. And that's all intrinsic. And so these would be considered short reflexes because they're happening just within the GI tract. But then sometimes we have influence from the brain as well. And these would be considered extrinsic regulations. So things that can cause extrinsic regulation of your GI tract are going to be external stimuli, like you see food, you smell food, you taste food. Your brain is then going to tell your GI tract to start making preparations for the food to come. Okay. So one of the things that does a really good job at causing the nervous system to start working this is especially true for things that are sour. So I want everyone right now to close your eyes and imagine biting into a lemon or putting a sour warhead or something really sour in your mouth. Did your mouth start salivating? Yeah. Okay. So especially sour will cause your mouth to start salivating and start your GI tract to start working. So I really apologize if in a few minutes or 30 minutes or so, your stomach starts growling because your stomach is starting to make acid and you don't have food in there just yet. If you had breakfast, great. I'm helping you digest your food. But you might feel hungry in a little bit if your stomach starts making those secretions. But isn't that cool? You can start thinking about it, and then it just, even just thought, not even looking or smelling, or you can just think about it. Yeah.
So like when we smell or think about food and our mouth starts salivating, it's sending signals to our stomach to start producing the enzyme that breaks down food.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
So good.
So when your stomach growls, that means those secretions have occurred, but there's nothing inside the stomach to break down. So one of the other, and these are called long reflexes when it involves the brain. One of the other things that can be an extrinsic regulation of your GI tract activity is timing. Your brain will get used to you eating at a certain time every single day. And so it keeps track of that time and will have you make secretions at that time that it's used to you eating. And so when you miss that meal or you don't eat and it does those secretions anyways based off of timing, you're going to hear your stomach growl because secretions started being released into your stomach, but there was nothing there to break it down. So it's all just chemicals kind of just working within whatever fluid is there, causing your stomach to growl. And you're like, ooh, I should have ate. Okay, so your brain is also helping you time those things. Questions about that?
That's a long reflex.
That's a long reflex. Any involvement with your brain, and your brain is the one that keeps time, that would be considered a long reflex or an extrinsic regulation. Okay, questions about that? Okay. So functional anatomy of the digestive system. So there's a little chart in your lecture notes about where all these things occur. So ingestion only occurs at the mouth because ingestion is just simply putting food into your mouth, nothing else. Propulsion is how we move food forward through peristalsis. That's going to happen at your oropharynx where you swallow. Your esophagus, stomach, small intestine, and large intestine where peristalsis is going to be happening. So all of this, we'll do peristalsis. At the oropharynx is swallowing. which are both forms of propulsion. And then mechanical breakdown, which again is just making big chunks of food into smaller chunks of food. You're not making anything any more simple. This is going to happen at the oral cavity with your teeth and mastication, which is the scientific word for chewing. In your stomach with the churning of the stomach, and in your small intestine with segmentation. Okay, and then we have digestion or chemical breakdown, and this is where we use chemicals to make things simpler, to go from being a polymer to a monomer. This is going to be the oral cavity where we're mostly breaking down starches with our saliva, and we'll talk about that in a couple slides. Our stomach where we're mostly breaking down protein, and then our small intestine where we're breaking down pretty much everything. And then we have absorption. This is where we actually absorb the monomers, so the monosaccharides, the amino acids, the nucleotides, and the glycerol and fatty acids. That's all going to happen mostly at the small intestine. That's why I have the nutrients and water bolded, because most of our nutrients and water are going to be absorbed at the small intestine, with little of it being absorbed at the large intestine. And then we have very limited absorption at the mouth that I'll explain in a little bit. Anybody remember the treatment or the medication for angina that we talked about that goes underneath the tongue? Nitroglycerin. So we have absorption of a few things at the mouth, but not mostly not. Okay? So things like that, like nitroglycerin, it's usually lipid-soluble drugs that can be absorbed at the mouth. So it's going to be things like nitroglycerin, things like morphine that can be absorbed by the mouth, but not very many things can. And then elimination or defecation is going to happen at the large intestine, specifically the rectum, and then the anus. Both the rectum and the anus are part of the large intestine. Any questions? Oh, anybody still need this up? Okay, I'll wait. Yeah. Oh, it's fine. So absorption of nutrients and water, most of it is going to happen at the small intestine. Like more than 90% of what we absorb happens at the small intestine. The large intestine does whatever's left over. And it's mostly going to be like minerals and vitamins that get absorbed along with the last bit of water. But we'll get into that detail when we get to the large intestine on Digestive System 3.
I always thought they were the same thing.
What were?
The rectum and the anus.
No.
Yeah,
And a lot of people think that the large intestine and the colon are the same thing, but they're not. The colon is just one part of the large intestine.
I just looked.
Mm-hmm. The more you know, you learn something new every day, especially in this class. Okay, anybody else still need this up? Okay. So ingestion only occurs at the mouth, and it's just putting food into your mouth. And so anatomy of the oral cavity, it's also known as the mouth, but you should call it the oral cavity. It's made up of our lips, our cheeks, our teeth, our hard palate, which, what are the two bones that make up our hard palate? Maxilla and the palatine bone. Your soft palate with the end of it being called the uvula, which is the little hangy thing at the back of the throat. and then your tongue with the lingual frenulum. The lingual frenulum is the little piece of connective tissue that attaches your tongue to the bottom of your oral cavity. And so this allows for swallowing, speech, and taste. There are some individuals, and usually it's caught when you're an infant, that can be what's called tongue-tied. And that means that the lingual frenulum is either too short or too thick. And when it's too short or too thick, it can interfere with breastfeeding, which is what's going to be the most dangerous thing. So if it interferes with breastfeeding and the baby can't eat, then they'll need to do what's called a frenotomy and snip it to relieve the pressure, and so the tongue can move more freely. So this tongue tied here. It can interfere with feeding, with speech, and it can make oral hygiene more difficult. And in that case, you may need to snip it to resolve that. And in case you're curious, it's called a frenotomy, although I won't ask you for that term specifically. But people ask sometimes, so that's what it's called. There is a scientific term for that condition too. It's called ankyloglossia, but again, you don't have to know that. As long as you know that it's commonly known as being tongue-tied, I'm okay with that. Okay, questions about the anatomy of the oral cavity? Okay. So the digestive processes that occur there include ingestion, which again is just putting food into your mouth, and then mechanical breakdown. So mechanical breakdown is going to include what is happening there is mastication, which is chewing. You're just chewing your food. And what chewing is going to do is going to break down your food into smaller pieces so that it has more surface area, so the enzymes have an easier time breaking it down. You can break down a lot of smaller pieces better than you can break down a large piece of food. And so you do need to know the different teeth types. Your incisors, which are the 4 in the front on the top and the bottom, those are going to bite off chunks. The next one on each side, the pointy ones, are called canines. Those are for tearing off pieces, so you use that for like protein or meat. So red meat or chicken, you use your canines to tear that apart. And then your premolars and molars, which are the flatter ones towards the back, those are going to grind your food down. So they all have a different job. And so I don't need you to know the difference between deciduous and permanent teeth. Deciduous teeth are just your baby teeth. All you need to know is incisors are the first 4. Canines are the pointy ones on either side. Then you have 2 premolars and 3 molars, with the last ones being your wisdom teeth.
What's the purpose of this teeth?
I think they used to have a more when the food that we used to eat back in the day, caveman days, were a lot harder. We would need those extra set of teeth to help break down food. We don't need them as much anymore with the way that we prepare food now. So now they cause more problems than they do good, which is why if they become impacted, we just take them out. Yeah. My daughter has a really cool, weird genetic abnormality where one of her premolars was never made. So she had a baby tooth there, but there was never an adult tooth in its place. It's just missing. And it was so weird to see it on an x-ray. And kid x-rays are weird in general because you see baby teeth and you see all these weird teeth at the bottom as well that are like trying to come in. They look like a monster. But she just had like one empty slot where that tooth was just never made. Like it was just a genetic abnormality. They never had the recipe to make that particular tooth. So she's only in 4th grade, so she had to get braces. She'll have to do 2 rounds of braces. So she did her first round to kind of shift her teeth around, and so there's not a big gaping hole when she loses that tooth. and then she'll do it again in junior high to strain them all out again. Poor her. Incisors,
Yeah, because I have that. I just was lucky I didn't have like separation when my teeth came in. So I never had to have braces, but I'm missing like one of my I have a midline adjustment is what it's called. So that my teeth don't look
So weird. So these little weird, and I didn't have that, and I don't know where it came from in the genetic line. You start asking everyone. Huh?
The 230 ticket deposit.
Yeah. And so more digestive processes. We just talked about mechanical breakdown. Chemical breakdown is also going to happen at the mouth or oral cavity via your saliva. Your saliva is produced by your salivary glands. You do need to know the names of your salivary glands. We have the sublingual gland underneath the tongue. We have the submandibular gland that's underneath the mandible. And then the parotid gland up on the cheek next to, what is the cheek that is involved in mastication, or the cheek muscle that's involved in mastication that you learned at B32? Masseter. And so right next to the masseter is your parotid gland, which is another salivary gland. Your saliva is slightly acidic, about 6.75 to 7, which is going to help with the breakdown of the food. It includes amylase, and anything that ends with ASE tells you that it's an enzyme. Anything that ends in ASE. So amylase is an enzyme for breaking down carbohydrates, specifically starches like your pastas and breads and things like that. We have lingual lipase for breaking down fats. So ACE means enzyme, lip for lipids. Lipase breaks down fats, but in a very limited way, not too much. Bicarbonate is there to neutralize acids from acidic food that we might be eating. Mucin to lubricate and form what's called a bolus. So one other thing you're going to learn is that your food is called something different at different stages through the GI tract. So as it enters your mouth, it's food. Okay, but after you break it down through mastication and your saliva surrounds it and starts to break it down, right before you swallow it, and with your cheeks are involved as well, it forms a little slimy food ball before you swallow it. If you're somebody who actually chews their food properly. My husband, I feel like, just inhales it all and it just goes in whole. But you're supposed to form this ball that you swallow. It's called a bolus. So once you get into the swallowing phase, that food is called a bolus now, because it's taking on a different form. And it's already been broken down slightly, so it does have different structure. And then it's also going to have, your saliva is going to have lysozymes and antibodies to help for protection against pathogens as well. So when too little saliva is made, I know that guy at the top. Hey, Mike. Hi. Oh, no, keep going. Okay, when too little saliva is made, that leads to a condition called xerostomia. And xerostomia is essentially dry mouth. And dry mouth can lead to bad breath. Anybody know the scientific term for bad breath? Halitosis. So that also leads to halitosis, which is bad breath. And when you have xerostomia or dry mouth and you don't have enough of those antibodies and lysozymes to help to protect against those pathogens, you have a higher risk of an oral infection. So make sure you drink your water, as I do right now, because I don't want halitosis.
Is xerostomia like the same as like cotton mouth?
Yes. Mm-hmm. So I don't know what the exact mechanism is, but certain drugs like marijuana and others can cause that to happen, which just shuts down your salivary glands and lowers their production, and then you end up with dry mouth. Anybody still need this up? Yeah.
So the patients who are in the G2 right now, so they have more risk of the oral infection?
Yeah, if they have dry mouth, yeah, for sure. Because as your mouth stays moist, there's those lysozymes and antibodies in your saliva that are helping to protect against any pathogens that come in. And so if you're not producing saliva, you're not releasing those immune proteins and structures, and you can't fight off an infection. I mean, you have other barriers that'll help fight off that infection, but you don't get that initial clearance of pathogens, and so you're at a higher risk of it breaking the next barrier and the next barrier and making you infected. There is limited absorption of lipid-soluble drugs, like I mentioned, like nitroglycerin for angina, or opioids like morphine. Those can be given under the tongue and can be absorbed, but there are very few drugs that can be absorbed that way. Okay. Clinical note on gingivitis and periodontal disease. The outer protective coating of your teeth is called enamel. And how cavities are created is bacteria that are allowed to grow because either you're not brushing your teeth correctly or often enough, or you're not flossing correctly or often enough. Bacteria can get around that enamel and break it down, causing cavities, which another term for that are dental caries. So caries is a scientific term for a cavity. Another thing that can happen is you can have tartar buildup around your enamel and in the spaces as well between your teeth and the gums. And tartar is essentially just calcified plaque. Oh, I don't know how to spell calcified. And calcified plaque can either be caused by sugar or a bacteria film, which is why they say it's not good to give babies like bottles of juices, because then they have sugar all over their teeth, which can create a film, bacteria love sugar. And so the bacteria are trying to get at the sugar, but as they're doing that, they're also getting to the enamel of the teeth and causing cavities. And so sometimes what that tartar buildup can do is it can create calcifications like on the teeth, in between the gums and the tooth itself, causing little breaks in between the seal between your tooth and your gum. And so then bacteria can get into those spaces where they don't belong. And then you can get a bacterial infection of your gums called gingivitis. And 95% of adults experience some level of gingivitis. 95%. Can you believe that? That's most of us. If this is left untreated, immune cells, as they are trying to fight off the bacteria, can damage your periodontal ligament or periodontal ligament, which is the ligament that holds your tooth to the underlying bone. Anybody remember if this is a fibrous joint or a cartilaginous joint or a synovial joint from Bio 32? Fibrous. Could be a fibrous joint. And so your immune cells, as they're trying to fight off the infection, can then end up breaking down that ligament, causing loose teeth. And then also your osteoclasts can dissolve the bone around your teeth. And when it gets that bad, where bone is being broken down, that is called periodontal disease. You are at increased risk of gingivitis and periodontal disease if you have diabetes mellitus. So if you have high sugar levels, that sugar can leach out of the blood, get all in around your teeth and gums, leading to periodontal disease. Also smoking. Also oral piercings. And I'm proud to say that my dentist said that my oral piercing is placed in a way that it does not interfere with my teeth. Because at first he's like, let me take a look, because I might not want you to wear that. And I'm like, okay. So he looked, he's like, oh, you're fine. It doesn't touch your teeth at all, so. But it can. So if it does rub up against your teeth, it can cause friction, which is going to break down the enamel, which can then cause you to have more cavities and such. Yeah. This right here?
No, to the left, where it says under bacteria breakdown.
Oh, dental caries.
Okay.
So caries. That's another word for cavities. Okay, any questions about gingivitis or periodontal disease? Okay, the pharynx and esophagus move food from the mouth to the stomach. Your pharynx is a common passageway for swallowing, so food and liquid, and also breathing air. It connects the mouth to the esophagus and opens to the trachea, which also leads to the lungs. And then you should already know the epiglottis closes off the trachea when you swallow to prevent you from choking. Anybody remember what specific tissue type makes up your nasopharynx, which is part of the respiratory tract?
With goblet cells?
Yes, yes. Now, what is the tissue type that makes up your oral pharynx and your laryngeal pharynx? Stratified squamous. Stratified squamous. And the reason why you have stratified squamous there is because you have food going down and lots of abrasion, okay, depending on the type of food that you're eating, or if you swallow it whole and don't break it down properly, that food is going to rub up against the walls of your pharynx and the esophagus. And so you need multiple layers to prevent you from causing friction to your underlying layers of tissue. Okay. So questions about that? Okay. So the scientific name for swallowing is deglutition. So that's another word to add to your vocabulary list, is deglutition. And so I don't need you to know all the steps that are described in your textbook. Just know this simple summary. Okay? Your tongue pushes the bolus into your pharynx. The receptors in your pharynx are going to initiate a swallowing reflex. So once that starts, you have no control over it anymore, and it's hard to get it to come back up. Okay? I experience it a lot. I'm somebody who swallows my gum all the time because I just get distracted, lose track of what I'm doing, and then I'm like, it's a reflex. I just swallow it, and then I try to get it to come back up, but at some point, it's no longer voluntary, and it's going to go down no matter what you do. So your receptors initiate a swallowing reflex, and then the food passes into the esophagus, and you'll notice while you're not swallowing, the epiglottis is up. As you swallow and that bolus is making its way down, your epiglottis covers up that trachea. Okay. And what tissue type makes up the epiglottis? Elastic cartilage. Yes. And so you can see that here as well. Here's the bolus of food. As it's making its way down, that epiglottis will close off the trachea. Okay. Sometimes that epiglottis does fail and food does get down your windpipe or respiratory tract. What is the structure that it touches that's going to cause you to start coughing? Karina, yeah. All right, the esophagus. It is a muscular tube. It connects the pharynx to the stomach, so your throat to your stomach. It is gated at either end by some sphincters. So here's our first introduction of sphincters. You have the upper esophageal sphincter at the very top, okay, which stays closed unless you're swallowing, then it opens up to allow food to go down. And then your gastroesophageal sphincter, which connects the stomach to the esophagus. However, the top part of the stomach is also called the cardia, so we also call it the cardiac sphincter. Okay, and the top part of the stomach is the region that's closest to the heart, which is why they call it the cardia, but it's also known as the cardiac sphincter. I will be calling it the cardiac sphincter. It's a lot easier than saying the gastroesophageal sphincter. But you can say either way on an exam, either one that you want to call it. And then it's going to move food down by peristalsis. Peristalsis is the only function that's happening in the esophagus. We don't break down food mechanically or chemically. We don't do any absorption or any of that. The only thing that's happening in the esophagus is peristalsis. That is it. We're only moving food forward. That's its only function. Now, it does make its way past the diaphragm. So the stomach sits underneath the diaphragm. The esophagus has to make its way from the throat down the thoracic cavity, past the diaphragm into the stomach. And so the opening of the diaphragm that allows the esophagus to pass through, it's just the opening, is called the esophageal hiatus. Okay, so the esophageal hiatus is the opening in the diaphragm that allows the esophagus to pass through. That'll be on your learn list today for the digestive anatomy lab. Questions about that? Okay. And then don't forget that the outer layer of your GI tract wall at the esophagus is called the adventitia. Everywhere else it's called serosa. Okay, but at the esophagus, the outermost layer or the deepest layer is called the adventitia. This is for the esophagus only. Okay, and peristalsis, it's its only function. That's the only thing happening in the esophagus. It does not contribute to any kind of breakdown or absorption or anything else. Some clinical notes about the stomach. You can experience something called a hiatal hernia. A hiatal hernia is the weakening of the cardiac sphincter. And so it does not get the support of the diaphragm. So the cardiac sphincter is that sphincter at the top of the stomach that connects the esophagus to the stomach. And so that sphincter there, if it becomes weakened, it's not getting the reinforcement that it should from the diaphragm. And so what can happen is the top part of the stomach can go above the diaphragm, okay, which is going to cause issues with digestion. It can cause a lot of heartburn too, because that cardiac sphincter is supported by the diaphragm, and that kind of keeps food from coming up into your esophagus. So if you have this hiatal hernia where the cardiac sphincter is now on top of the diaphragm, you don't get that extra reinforcement for that sphincter, and you're more likely to experience heartburn.
Professor,
Yeah.
heavy lifting?
Yes, it could be from heavy lifting as well. Yeah. I sometimes bring up anybody watch Friends? There's an episode where Joey loses his health insurance and he decides to work out, and he's like, it's like 15-pound dumbbells, and then he ends up getting a hiatal hernia, and he's like, damn you 15s. And then he doesn't have insurance, so he doesn't want to go to the doctor, and Chandler has to pay for it. But the next thing is heartburn, also known as acid reflux. Now, what's scary about a heartburn, if you've never experienced it before, it can seem like an MI. because it is a substernal pain, so a pain behind the sternum. And so if anybody goes in for any kind of chest pain, they will automatically do like an ECG and run testing for heart attack just to be sure. So it could be heartburn, could be gallbladder pain, but they're always going to double check, especially with males, to make sure that it's not a heart attack. Causes include eating and drinking to excess. So your stomach just gets too full or too irritated from alcohol, and it can cause heartburn. Risks of heartburn include obesity or pregnancy. And if you run or do some kind of vigorous activity after you've eaten, because your food is just moving up and down in the stomach, which can cause the cardiac sphincter to open and cause that juice to come up. So this is an image showing you heartburn, where the acid from the stomach goes up into the esophagus. And the last thing is GERD, or gastroesophageal reflux disease. And GERD, heartburn is the first symptom of GERD. But also, patients with GERD can experience regurgitation, where it feels like the food from your stomach is coming up into your esophagus and into your throat. It can also cause excessive belching or burping or nausea. Although you don't have to have all of these symptoms to have GERD. What GERD is where you're experiencing the heartburn or one of the other symptoms or signs, but that it's chronic. So this is something that's happening frequently over the long term. Then it's considered GERD. Okay? Heartburn would be a symptom or a sign of GERD. One thing that it can do is it can lead to GERD, if you're experiencing this heartburn on a regular basis. It can lead to esophagitis. And then also, if your esophagus is being damaged by the acid and has to regenerate, and then you have heartburn again, and then it gets damaged and has to regenerate over and over because you're experiencing this frequently, what are you more at risk for? Cancer. Ulcers, yes, you can have esophageal ulcers, but the regeneration, constant regeneration of that tissue can lead to esophageal cancer. Oh, right, 9:25. Okay. I'm going to quickly go through this in 10 minutes. But next is that the stomach temporarily stores food and begins protein digestion. I already mentioned that the very first portion of the stomach is called the cardia. It's closest to the heart. You do have a rounded portion at the top. This is called the fundus. We'll have other organs that have a fundus as well. The body is the main portion of it here. Pylorus is the last section at the bottom. And so we actually have another sphincter. So we have the cardiac sphincter at the top, but then we have another sphincter at the bottom where the pylorus is, and that is called the pyloric sphincter. And there are curves also to the stomach, and I'll erase some of these little circly things that I did. And you're going to find these things in lab today looking at the anatomy. But you have curves as well. And so your stomach has a lesser curvature, which is a smaller curve of the stomach, and then you have the greater curvature, which is the greater or larger curve. But again, this is called the pyloric sphincter at the bottom, cardiac sphincter at the top. There's a little clinical note in your lecture notes that you can have what's called pyloric stenosis as an infant, which means that this sphincter down here becomes thickened, and it's really hard for food to move to the next spot. And so what can happen with these infants that have pyloric stenosis, it can cause them to vomit, which can cause dehydration and cause a lot of issues for infants because their food can't go to the next portion of the GI tract because that sphincter is too thickened. Some things we'll talk about on Monday include the mucosa of the stomach that has a mucus layer, as well as gastric pits that have certain cells that we'll learn about on Monday that produce things like pepsin, which is an enzyme, or gastrin, which is a hormone. And then what we told you already is that the stomach has an extra muscular layer called the oblique layer. Another specialized structure of the stomach are rugae. And rugae are the little folds within the lining of the stomach that are going to help it to stretch. So your stomach is like an accordion with this rugae, and when you put food in it, it stretches out. Okay? So it's just like an accordion. Those rugae are just like that. Cassandra, Professor Green, sorry. Can you go over the little bit of lab intro with them for me and lab? Great, awesome. Okay,